The golden mask gleams in the morning light, perfect and unblemished, catching every ray of sun that dares to touch its surface. Behind this radiant facade, a soul trembles in the darkness, hands shaking as they adjust the weight of a crown that was never meant for their head. This is the theater of grandiosity, where every gesture must be choreographed, every word measured against the impossible standard of flawless superiority. Listen closely, for within this tale lies the architecture of our deepest wounds, the way we construct elaborate monuments to hide our most tender vulnerabilities. In the beginning, there was a child who learned that love was conditional, that acceptance came only through performance, that their worth was measured not by their being but by their doing. This is the cruel paradox of grandiosity and trying to transcend human limitation. It creates the most human of all sufferings, the agony of disconnection from one's own heart. The mask that was meant to attract love repels it, for authentic connection requires the very vulnerability that the false self was designed to eliminate. Like a peacock whose magnificent plumage serves both to attract and to burden, the narcissist's grandiosity becomes the very thing that prevents them from receiving what they most desperately seek. In the depths of the unconscious, the true self waits with infinite patience, like a forgotten child in a locked room, trusting that someday the key will turn and the door will open. It knows that beneath the golden mask lies not the monster the ego fears, but simply a human being worthy of love, not for their achievements or specialness, but for the simple fact of their existence. The compensatory nature of grandiosity reveals itself in moments of quiet desperation, when the performance falters and the raw need breaks through. In these cracks between acts, we glimpse the enormous effort required to maintain the illusion, the constant vigilance against exposure, the exhausting labor of being more than human while denying the beauty of being simply authentically human. Jung spoke of enantiodromia, the principle by which everything eventually turns into its opposite. The very grandiosity meant to ensure love guarantees its absence. The superiority designed to elevate creates the deepest form of isolation. The mask crafted to hide imperfection becomes the greatest imperfection of all, not because it fails to convince others, but because it succeeds in convincing its wearer that they are nothing without it. The golden mask reflects not the light of the sun, but the desperate hunger of a soul that has forgotten how to feed itself with authentic nourishment. Each admiring glance becomes a fix, temporary relief from the withdrawal symptoms of disconnection from the true self. The narcissist becomes addicted to their own reflection, not because they love what they see, but because they fear what lies beyond the mirror's edge. And yet, even in this prison of perfection, the possibility of freedom exists, for the mask, no matter how perfectly crafted, cannot change the fundamental truth it seeks to hide, that beneath every performance lies a heart capable of genuine love and worthy of receiving it. The very intensity of the narcissist's need to appear perfect points toward the profound love they bear for their rejected self, a love so fierce it would rather create an elaborate fiction than accept the possibility of that self's destruction. The path forward requires not the destruction of the mask, for it has served its purpose with heroic dedication, but its gentle retirement. Like a soldier returning from war, the false self deserves honor for its service, even as it steps aside to allow the true self to emerge. This is not a violent unmasking, but a tender recognition, a slow unfurling of courage sufficient to face the world without armor. In the end, the golden mask reveals itself as both the problem and the solution, the wound and the healing balm. For, in learning to see through its necessity, we develop the compassion required to set it aside. The very perfectionism that created the prison contains within it the seeds of its own transcendence, not through achieving perfect performance, but through perfect acceptance of imperfection itself. The child behind the mask waits still, patient as stone, trusting as sunrise, ready to step into the light not as a god or a ghost, but as the magnificent, flawed, utterly human being they were always meant to be. The surface of the water beckons with false promise, mirror smooth and infinitely deep, reflecting back an image so captivating that the soul forgets the world beyond its edge, like the mythic Narcissus, frozen in eternal contemplation of his own reflection. The inflated ego discovers in its mirror not truth, but the most seductive of lies, that the image is more real than the flesh, the reflection more substantial than the substance it reflects. In this sacred pool of self-regard, time stops and the world shrinks to the circumference of one's own perceived magnificence. The narcissist gazes not with love, but with desperate hunger, consuming their own image like a starving person devouring shadows, never noticing that each bite leaves them emptier than before. This is not self-love, but self-cannibalism, the soul feeding on its own reflection, until nothing remains but the hollow echo of what once might have been authentic being. Jung understood the profound tragedy hidden within this enchantment. The mirror becomes both temple and tomb, a sacred space where the ego worships its own fabricated deity, while the true self slowly suffocates in the airless chamber of self-obsession. Each glance into this psychological mirror reinforces the fundamental delusion that existence begins and ends with the perceiver, that reality itself is merely a stage upon which the grandiose self performs its endless monologue. The mythic pool reflects more than features. It reflects the deepest wound of human consciousness, the split between who we are and who we imagine ourselves to be. The narcissist's relationship with their reflection becomes a masterclass in projection, seeing in the mirror's surface not their actual face, but the idealized phantom they have spent their lifetime constructing. The image gazes back with the false promise of completion, whispering that if only one could merge completely with this reflection, all yearning would cease, all emptiness would be filled. But mirrors, by their very nature, are surfaces without depth. They can only reflect, never create. They show what appears before them but remain forever empty of substance themselves. The narcissist tragedy lies in mistaking this emptiness for fullness, this mere reflection for the source of light itself. They become trapped in a hall of mirrors, where every surface shows the same face, every angle reveals the same obsession, until the entire world becomes a conspiracy of reflection designed to feed their insatiable appetite for self-recognition. This reflected glory demands constant renewal, for mirrors fade and images blur without the steady light of attention to illuminate them. The narcissist becomes enslaved to the maintenance of their reflection, polishing every surface that might show their face, adjusting lighting to optimize their appearance, curating reality itself to ensure that every possible mirror reflects their chosen image. The hunger that drives this endless gazing is not born of self-love but of self-doubt, so profound, it cannot be consciously acknowledged. The mirror becomes a drug, offering temporary relief from the withdrawal symptoms of disconnection from authentic being. Each reflection provides a momentary fix, a brief respite from the gnawing emptiness that waits in the spaces between mirrors. But like all addictions, the relief is temporary, and the dose must be constantly increased to achieve the same effect. In the depths of the unconscious, banished aspects of the self, the vulnerable, the uncertain, the genuinely human, gather in the shadows beyond the mirror's reach. These parts of the psyche grow increasingly desperate for recognition, for integration, for the simple acknowledgement of their existence, but the ego, transfixed by its reflection, cannot spare even a glance for these forgotten territories of the soul. The mirror that was meant to show the self becomes the instrument of the self's abandonment. The pool that captured Narcissus holds deeper waters than the myth reveals. Beneath the surface reflection lies the profound truth that Jung called the collective unconscious, the vast reservoir of shared human experience, the common ground of our deepest fears and longings, the wellspring from which authentic identity emerges. But to reach these depths, one must be willing to dive beneath the surface, to leave the safety of reflected image for the dangerous mystery of actual being. The narcissist's imprisonment in reflected glory creates a paradox of intimacy. gazing constantly at their own image. They believe themselves to be in the most intimate relationship possible with themselves. Yet this apparent self-intimacy is actually the most sophisticated form of self-avoidance, a way of looking at oneself without actually seeing, of being with oneself without actually being present. The reflection becomes a barrier between the ego and the authentic self, a beautiful, compelling distraction from the difficult work of genuine self-encounter. The mirror's lie extends beyond simple vanity into the realm of existential confusion. The narcissist begins to believe that being seen is the same as being, that recognition equals reality, that if enough mirrors reflect their image clearly enough, they will somehow achieve the solidity and substance that their reflection lacks. They mistake the hunger for admiration as evidence of their own magnificence, not recognizing it as proof of their profound disconnection from any authentic source of sustenance. Yet even in this hall of mirrors, the possibility of awakening exists, for the very intensity of the need to be reflected points towards something deeper, a soul so hungry for real recognition that it would rather feast on shadows than starve completely. The obsession with reflection reveals, paradoxically, the depth of the longing for genuine being. Like an arrow shot backward, the narcissist's desperate gaze into mirrors points toward the archer, the authentic self that seeks not reflection but recognition, not image but substance, not the pool's surface but its mysterious depths. The mirror that traps can also liberate, but only when the narcissist develops the courage to look beyond the reflection to the one who is looking. In that moment of recognition, I am not the image, but the one who sees the image. The spell begins to break. The pool becomes not a prison, but a doorway, not a destination, but a threshold, not the end of the journey, but its true beginning. The reflection fades like morning mist, revealing beneath its surface not emptiness but the infinite depths of authentic being, vast, mysterious, and ultimately real, in ways that no mirror could ever capture or contain. The water clears, and for the first time, the narcissist sees not their image but their face, not their reflection but their presence, not what they appear to be but who they actually are. The myth of Narcissus ends with transformation, not death, but metamorphosis into something far more beautiful than any reflection could ever be. In the deepest chambers of the unconscious mind, where the light of conscious awareness has never penetrated, a rebellion is stirring. Here, in these forgotten dungeons of the psyche, dwell all the aspects of being that the grandiose ego has deemed unworthy of its golden throne: the vulnerable child, the uncertain seeker, the one who weeps in solitude, the one who fails and stumbles and bleeds. All these have been banished to the underworld of the shadow, where they gather strength in darkness, preparing for their inevitable return. Jung recognized this shadow not as evil but as completeness denied, not as darkness to be feared, but as wholeness demanding integration. The narcissist's shadow contains not monsters, but the very humanity they have disowned in their desperate flight toward perfection. Every tear unshed, every fear unacknowledged, every moment of authentic need suppressed in service of the grandiose image, all of these collect in the shadow like water behind a dam, building pressure with each passing day of denial. Listen to the whispers rising from these depths. They speak not in the polished language of the ego, but in the raw grammar of authentic feeling. I am afraid, they say. I am small. I need help. I make mistakes. I feel lost. I want to be held. These confessions, so natural to the human heart, become forbidden texts in the kingdom of grandiosity, banned books that must never be opened, lest they reveal the mortal nature of the supposedly divine ruler. The shadow's rebellion begins subtly, like cracks appearing in a seemingly solid foundation. The grandiose self notices moments of inexplicable anxiety, sudden waves of emptiness that wash over them in the midst of their greatest triumphs. They feel their carefully constructed superiority wobble when faced with genuine criticism. Watch their confidence evaporate in the presence of authentic vulnerability from others. These are not weaknesses, but messages from the shadow, urgent communications from the disowned self demanding recognition. As the rebellion gains momentum, the split between the conscious grandiose self and the unconscious authentic self becomes increasingly untenable. The energy required to maintain the separation grows exponentially, like trying to hold back the ocean with bare hands. The narcissist finds themselves working harder and harder to maintain their image, needing ever more dramatic displays of superiority to convince themselves of their own specialness. But with each escalation, the shadow grows correspondingly stronger, fed by the very energy used to suppress it. In dreams and slips of tongue, in moments of unguarded honesty and unexpected emotional outbursts, the shadow begins to leak through the carefully maintained barriers. The grandiose self experiences these eruptions as foreign invasions, mysterious attacks from an unknown enemy. They cannot recognize these shadow expressions as their own disowned aspects because to do so would require acknowledging the very humanity they have spent their lifetime denying. The rebellion manifests as a growing sense of internal warfare, a civil war within the psyche between the false self that demands perfection and the true self that longs for acceptance. The grandiose ego, like any dictator facing insurrection, responds with increasingly harsh measures. It doubles down on its superiority, builds higher walls against vulnerability, creates more elaborate performances to distract from the growing chaos within. But these very measures only fuel the rebellion, providing the shadow with more authentic material to claim as its own. Jung understood that the shadow contains not only the personal rejected aspects, but also the collective human experiences that connect us to our shared humanity. The narcissist shadow holds the universal fears, longings, and struggles that make us recognizably human to one another. In denying their shadow, they cut themselves off not only from their own wholeness, but from the entire human community, becoming psychological refugees in their own lives. The most profound aspect of the shadow's rebellion lies in its ultimate motivation. The banished aspects of the psyche do not seek destruction but reunion, not revenge but recognition, not the overthrow of consciousness but its completion. Like children who act out not from malice but from a desperate need for attention, the shadow's increasingly dramatic manifestations are actually love letters written in the only language that can penetrate the ego's defenses, the language of disruption. As the rebellion intensifies, the narcissist begins to experience what Jung called the night sea journey, a descent into the chaotic waters of the unconscious, where familiar landmarks disappear and the carefully mapped territory of the ego becomes useless. This is terrifying for the grandiose self, which has based its entire identity on maintaining control and superiority. Yet this journey into darkness is not punishment, but initiation, not destruction, but transformation. The shadow's arsenal contains weapons that the conscious mind cannot defend against because they emerge from within the fortress itself. Shame attacks from inside the castle walls, self-doubt whispers through the throne room corridors, and authentic feeling breaks through like water through the smallest crack, expanding until the entire structure threatens to flood. In the midst of this internal chaos, moments of profound recognition begin to emerge. The narcissist catches glimpses of their own face without the golden mask, sees themselves not as the monster they feared they would be without their grandiosity, but as a human being struggling with the universal challenges of existence. These moments are simultaneously terrifying and liberating. Terrifying because they threaten the entire edifice of false self, liberating because they offer the first taste of authentic being in perhaps decades. The rebellion reaches its climax when the shadow's truth becomes undeniable. All the vulnerability, all the uncertainty, all the human need that has been locked away comes flooding back into consciousness, like a dam finally bursting. This is not a gentle return, but a revolutionary upheaval that shakes the very foundations of the narcissist's identity. The throne of grandiosity cracks, the crown of superiority tumbles, and for a terrifying, liberating moment, the deposed ruler stands naked in the ruins of their false kingdom. Yet in this apparent destruction lies the seed of authentic creation. The shadow's rebellion is revealed as the psyche's deepest wisdom in action, the unconscious mind's sophisticated strategy for forcing integration. What appears as breakdown is actually breakthrough. What seems like ending is actually beginning. The shadow has not destroyed the self, but revealed it, not conquered the ego, but completed it. The materials of the crumbled throne and fallen crown do not disappear, but become available for a new kind of construction. Not a palace built on the denial of humanity, but a home that can accommodate the full spectrum of human experience. The vulnerable child emerges from the dungeons, not as prisoner but as honored guest. The uncertain seeker takes their rightful place, not as shame but as wisdom. The one who needs help is welcomed, not as weakness, but as the foundation of authentic relationship. In this transformed landscape, the former narcissist begins to understand that their greatest fear, being ordinary, being human, being flawed, was actually their greatest gift waiting to be unwrapped. The shadow's rebellion has not diminished them but revealed their true dimensions, not exposed their poverty but uncovered their actual wealth, not proven their unworthiness, but demonstrated their inherent belonging to the magnificent, messy, gloriously imperfect human family. The integration of the shadow marks not the end of specialness, but the beginning of authentic uniqueness. No longer needing to be better than others, the individual discovers the profound specialness of being exactly who they are, complete with all their contradictions, struggles, and beautiful imperfections. The rebellion that seemed to threaten everything ultimately gives them everything they were actually seeking, not the hollow victory of superiority, but the solid ground of genuine self-acceptance. The shadow's work complete. The internal war ends not in victory or defeat, but in reunion. The exiled aspects of the self return home to a kingdom transformed, where vulnerability and strength dance together, where uncertainty and confidence share the throne, where the full spectrum of human experience is not only tolerated, but celebrated as the raw material from which authentic wisdom is forged. In the end, the shadow's rebellion reveals itself as the unconscious mind's love song to wholeness, a fierce and tender insistence that no part of the self should be abandoned in the pursuit of perfection. The darkness that seemed so threatening proves to be not the absence of light, but light's secret partner, not the enemy of consciousness, but its completion, not the destroyer of the self, but its truest friend and most faithful guardian of authentic being. Deep within the architecture of the grandiose self lies Jung's most penetrating insight, that every display of superiority is actually a confession written in invisible ink, every crown a mask for the wound it seeks to heal, every throne built upon the quicksand of unbearable inferiority. This is the great secret that the narcissist guards more fiercely than any treasure. Their magnificent palace of self-regard stands not on bedrock, but on the shifting sands of profound inadequacy. Each golden brick, a desperate attempt to build high enough that the foundation's instability will never be discovered. The compensatory mechanism operates like a psychological seesaw frozen in permanent imbalance. On one side sits the unbearable weight of felt inadequacy, too heavy to be consciously carried, too threatening to be directly acknowledged. On the other side, the ego piles higher and higher the sandbags of grandiosity. Each achievement, each moment of recognition, each performance of superiority, adding weight to the desperate attempt to lift the original wound above the threshold of awareness. But this is a battle that can never be won through accumulation, for the fundamental inadequacy is not actually inadequate, it is simply human. Jung understood that this mechanism emerges from a profound misunderstanding about the nature of worth itself. The child who would later don the golden mask received early messages that their value was conditional, that love must be earned through excellence, that ordinary humanity was insufficient to guarantee belonging. unable to grasp that these messages said nothing about their actual worth and everything about the limitations of their early environment. The child began the lifelong project of becoming worthy through becoming superior. The tragedy deepens when we recognize that the original wound was not a true inadequacy, but the normal vulnerability of human development meeting an environment incapable of reflecting back the child's inherent worth. Like a seed planted in soil lacking essential nutrients, the child's natural growth towards self-acceptance was stunted, twisted toward the pursuit of external validation as a substitute for the internal recognition that was their birthright. The compensatory crown becomes heavier with each passing year, ornate with accumulated achievements, brilliant with reflected praise, magnificent in its elaborate construction. Yet no amount of external decoration can change the fundamental instability of its foundation. The narcissist lives in constant fear that someone will notice the crown's weight, will ask too many questions about why it's needed, will somehow discover that beneath the royal regalia sits not a king or queen but a frightened child, still waiting for someone to say, "You are enough exactly as you are." This psychological compensation creates its own physics, its own laws of energy and motion. The greater the felt inadequacy, the more elaborate the compensatory display must become. The deeper the wound, the higher the throne must be built. Jung's genius lay in recognizing that this compensation was not mere vanity, but the psyche's sophisticated attempt at self-healing. The compensatory mechanism operates on the principle of psychological projection. Unable to locate their own worth within themselves, narcissists become dependent on seeing it reflected in the eyes of others. They develop exquisite sensitivity to the subtle signals of admiration or dismissal, reading the social environment like meteorologists tracking storms. Each approving glance becomes evidence of their specialness, each neutral expression a potential threat to their entire self-concept, each criticism a catastrophic challenge to their compensatory structure. The compensatory crown demands not only constant maintenance but constant elevation. What impressed yesterday becomes ordinary today, requiring new heights of achievement, new displays of specialness, new evidence of superiority. The narcissist lives on a treadmill of escalating compensation, running faster and faster just to maintain the same relative position above their foundational inadequacy. Like a drug addiction, the doses of validation required for the same effect increase over time, leading to increasingly desperate measures to achieve the necessary high. Jung observed that this compensation often manifests through the mechanism of comparison, unable to feel adequate on their own merits. Narcissists develop an almost supernatural ability to position themselves favorably relative to others. They become connoisseurs of hierarchy, experts at finding the angles from which they appear superior, masters at highlighting others' flaws to elevate their own relative position. This comparative thinking becomes so automatic that they lose the ability to experience their own worth independently of how it measures against others. The compensation extends beyond conscious manipulation into the realm of unconscious identification. The narcissist begins to believe their own compensatory story so completely that they lose contact with the original wound it was designed to heal. They become method actors so committed to their role that they forget they are performing, prisoners so long in their golden cage that they mistake the bars for the boundaries of reality itself. Yet even within this elaborate compensatory structure, the original wound continues to pulse with life, sending up signals that something essential is missing. These signals manifest as chronic emptiness, as the haunting sense that no achievement will ever be enough, as the desperate hunger that no amount of admiration can truly satisfy. The compensatory mechanism that was meant to heal the wound instead creates a barrier to healing, protecting the injury so effectively that it can never receive the direct attention it needs to actually mend. The profound irony of compensation lies in its success at achieving exactly the opposite of its intended goal. Designed to eliminate the experience of inadequacy, it actually amplifies and perpetuates it by making the original wound the invisible foundation of the entire personality structure. The crown that was meant to elevate becomes the weight that prevents rising. The throne that promised security becomes the prison that prevents freedom. The superiority that seemed to solve everything becomes the problem that creates everything else. The dismantling of compensation cannot be achieved through force or confrontation, for these approaches only activate the very inadequacy the mechanism was designed to protect. Instead, healing comes through the patient, tender work of building genuine self-regard from the inside out, creating an internal foundation so solid that external validation becomes a pleasant addition rather than a desperate necessity. This transformation requires what Jung called the transcendent function, the ability to hold both the compensatory grandiosity and the underlying inadequacy in consciousness simultaneously, without being identified with either. In this space of conscious holding, the original wound can finally receive the direct attention it has always needed, not as something to be hidden or compensated for, but as a doorway to authentic self-compassion. The compensatory crown begins to feel less necessary as the head that wears it discovers its own inherent nobility. The throne starts to seem less important as the one who sits upon it realizes their worth was never dependent on elevation above others. In the end, the compensatory mechanism reveals itself as both the problem and the solution, the wound and the attempted healing, the barrier to wholeness and the pathway through it. The very intensity of the compensation points toward the profound love the psyche bears for its authentic core, a love so fierce it would create elaborate fiction rather than allow that core to experience abandonment. When this love is finally redirected from protection through grandiosity to recognition through acceptance, the crown can be set aside not in defeat but in victory, not because it failed but because it is no longer needed. The king or queen who removes their compensatory crown discovers they were never ruling through divine right, but through divine love. The same love that created the crown in the first place, now free to express itself through the simple revolutionary act of being authentically, ordinarily. In the realm of the narcissistic psyche stands a magnificent palace, its towers reaching toward heaven, its walls gleaming with gold and precious stones, its architecture so breathtaking that all who behold it cannot help but marvel at its splendor. Yet those who look closely enough to examine the foundation discover a terrifying truth. This entire magnificent structure rests not upon bedrock, but upon the shifting opinions of others, each brick held in place by approval, each beam supported by admiration, each stone dependent upon the favorable gaze of external eyes. This is the house of cards scaled to palatial proportions, an architectural marvel built entirely from borrowed materials. The narcissist has constructed their entire sense of self from the outside in, gathering fragments of validation like a cosmic collector, arranging these pieces into something that appears solid from a distance, but trembles at the slightest touch of genuine examination. Every compliment becomes a cornerstone, every moment of recognition a supporting beam, every expression of admiration a crucial element in the elaborate engineering of manufactured self-worth. Jung understood that this external construction of identity represents one of the most sophisticated forms of psychological dependency ever devised. The narcissist appears supremely independent, seemingly self-sufficient, apparently requiring nothing from anyone. Yet this apparent autonomy masks the most complete form of reliance, an existence so thoroughly dependent on external validation that the slightest withdrawal of approval threatens not just discomfort, but total collapse of the entire identity structure. The quicksand foundation reveals itself in moments of crisis, when the usual sources of validation suddenly become unavailable, or, worse yet, transform into sources of criticism. The palace built on external validation requires constant maintenance, endless renovation, perpetual construction projects to shore up any weakness in the structure. The narcissist becomes both architect and construction worker, designer and maintenance crew, working around the clock to ensure that every element of their magnificent facade remains intact. They develop extraordinary sensitivity to the subtle shifts in their foundation, the barely perceptible change in someone's tone, the micro-expression that suggests less than complete admiration, the pause that might indicate doubt or questioning. The tragedy deepens when we recognize that this magnificent palace, for all its apparent splendor, remains forever hollow at its core, built entirely from external materials. It contains no internal chambers where the authentic self might dwell in peace. The narcissist becomes a curator of their own museum, a tour guide through the magnificent halls of their constructed identity, but never a resident who can simply rest in the quiet sanctuary of genuine self-acceptance. Jung observed that this external construction creates what he called a false personality, not false in the sense of deliberately deceptive, but false in the sense of being built from materials that do not actually belong to the builder. The quicksand foundation manifests its instability through what appears to be paranoid sensitivity to criticism. The narcissist's extreme reaction to even gentle feedback is not simply arrogance or pride, but architectural necessity. When your entire structure rests on approval, any criticism becomes a potential sinkhole that could swallow the whole edifice. This creates a peculiar form of psychological geography, where the narcissist can only feel safe in environments that consistently reflect their desired image back to them. They become like plants that can only survive in very specific atmospheric conditions, requiring carefully controlled social climates, where the temperature of approval never varies, where the humidity of admiration remains constant, where the soil of validation is perpetually enriched with fresh compliments and recognition. The palace's maintenance demands increasingly sophisticated strategies for ensuring continued approval. The narcissist develops elaborate social engineering skills, learning to orchestrate interactions in ways that guarantee the desired responses. They become expert at creating situations where others feel compelled to offer praise, masters at positioning themselves in the most flattering light, virtuosos at turning every conversation toward topics that showcase their magnificence. Yet this very mastery reveals the depth of their dependency. The more skilled they become at generating approval, the more they prove their inability to exist without it. The House of Cards psychology creates its own internal weather patterns. When approval flows freely, the narcissist experiences psychological spring. Everything blooms, energy flows, life feels magnificent and full of possibility. But when criticism appears on the horizon, winter descends instantly. The same person who moments before felt godlike suddenly experiences themselves as worthless. The same achievements that seemed so impressive suddenly appear meaningless. The same relationships that felt so nourishing suddenly seem threatening and unreliable. Jung recognized that this external construction of self represents the ego's attempt to solve an impossible equation: how to build something permanent from inherently temporary materials. Opinions change. People leave. Admiration fades. Recognition becomes yesterday's news. Yet the narcissist continues the futile attempt to create lasting self-worth from these shifting sands, like trying to build a lighthouse from soap bubbles or construct a bridge from morning mist. The palace's magnificent appearance often convinces observers that the narcissist possesses tremendous self-confidence. Nothing could be further from the truth. What appears as confidence is actually the absence of confidence made architectural, the void of genuine self-regard filled with elaborate external constructions. True confidence rests on internal foundations: self-knowledge, self-acceptance, authentic relationship with one's own strengths and limitations. The narcissist's apparent confidence is actually anti-confidence, a structure designed to obscure the absence of the very thing it appears to display. The maintenance of the quicksand palace requires what Jung called persona inflation, the identification of the entire self with the carefully constructed public face. The narcissist cannot distinguish between who they are and how they appear, between their essence and their performance, between their being and their seeming. The palace becomes not just their home, but their entire reality, the external validation, not just their desire but their definition. Yet even within this precarious architecture, the possibility of transformation exists. The very instability of the quicksand foundation eventually becomes its own teacher. As the palace sways and trembles with each shift in external opinion, the narcissist may begin to question the wisdom of building their entire existence on such unreliable ground. The constant maintenance required, the perpetual anxiety about structural integrity, the exhausting vigilance needed to monitor the foundation, all of these may eventually point toward the desirability of finding more solid ground. The path forward requires not the destruction of the palace, but the gradual construction of internal foundations that can support authentic selfhood. This is delicate work, requiring the careful transfer of psychological weight from external to internal supports, like retrofitting a building while people are still living in it. The external validation can continue to provide beauty and pleasure, but it no longer needs to carry the entire structural load of identity. In this transformation, the narcissist discovers that they were never actually homeless, but had simply been looking for home in all the wrong places. The solid ground they sought in others' opinions was always available within their own being. The foundation they tried to build from external validation was always present in their inherent worth. The palace they constructed from borrowed materials was always overshadowed by the simple, indestructible cathedral of authentic selfhood that needs no external support to stand firm against any storm. The house of cards becomes a monument not to dependency but to the human capacity for growth, not to weakness, but to the strength required to rebuild one's entire existence on truer ground, not to failure but to the courage necessary to exchange a magnificent illusion for an ordinary, unshakable reality. This is control elevated to the level of religious practice, manipulation transformed into a form of prayer to the gods of certainty. The narcissist becomes both the conductor of an invisible orchestra and the composer of an unwritten symphony, believing that if they can just arrange all the external notes in perfect harmony, the discordant music of their internal suffering will finally resolve into something beautiful and peaceful. Jung understood that this compulsive need to control others represents the ego's attempt to solve the unsolvable puzzle of human existence: how to guarantee love, how to ensure acceptance, how to prevent abandonment, how to maintain the illusion of safety in a world that offers no such guarantees. Unable to find these assurances within themselves, narcissists project their need for control outward, turning every relationship into a stage where they direct the action, every interaction into a scene they must choreograph to achieve their desired outcome. The strings of control extend in all directions from the puppet master's chair, some visible and others invisible, some crude and others so subtle they appear almost telepathic. There are the obvious strings, the guilt trips and emotional blackmail, the tantrums and threats, the promises and bribes that clearly manipulate behavior. But there are also the gossamer threads, the micro-expressions that communicate displeasure, the silences that panther more loudly than words, the strategic vulnerabilities that invite rescue, the calculated generosities that create obligation. Each relationship becomes a complex mechanical device in the service of the narcissist's emotional regulation. Friends are maintained not for the joy of connection, but for their ability to provide consistent admiration. Family members are valued not for their inherent worth, but for their reliability as sources of validation, or their utility as supporting cast in the ongoing drama of the narcissist's specialness. Romantic partners are cherished not for their autonomous beauty, but for their willingness to play the role of devoted audience to the narcissist's starring performance in the theater of love. The puppet master's workshop reveals itself as a place of profound loneliness disguised as connection, surrounded by people who respond to their pull of strings. The narcissist experiences not the satisfaction of genuine relationship, but the hollow victory of successful manipulation. They achieve compliance but not communion, obedience but not love, performance but not presence. Jung recognized that this compulsive control represents what he called a power complex, an unconscious psychological structure that organizes experience around the acquisition and maintenance of dominance over others. The strings of manipulation become more elaborate as the narcissist's skill develops. They learn to read micro-expressions like a language, to identify the precise pressure points that will produce the desired response, to craft their persona so carefully that others feel compelled to provide the validation they seek. They become psychological artists, painters of emotional landscapes, sculptors of social dynamics, architects of interpersonal theater, all in service of the desperate need to feel safe in a world that offers no guarantees. Yet the more skilled the puppet master becomes, the more isolated they become from authentic human experience. Each successful manipulation confirms their belief that genuine love is impossible, that all relationships are transactions, that control is the only reliable path to getting their needs met. They prove to themselves, over and over again, that people only respond to strings being pulled, never recognizing that their compulsive pulling of strings prevents anyone from choosing to dance freely in their presence. The sacred ritual of control demands constant vigilance, endless strategizing, perpetual adjustment of the strings to maintain the desired configuration of responses from others. This control extends beyond conscious manipulation into the realm of energetic coercion. The narcissist learns to create emotional atmospheres so charged with their need that others feel compelled to respond, to generate psychological pressure so intense that compliance seems like the only option for peace, to orchestrate situations where providing the desired validation appears to be the other person's idea rather than the fulfillment of an elaborate manipulation. They become masters of what Jung called participation mystique, the unconscious merger of boundaries that makes others feel responsible for the narcissist's emotional state. The strings of control create their own mythology, complete with heroic narratives about how much the narcissist does for others, how much they sacrifice, how generous they are with their time and attention. These stories obscure the transactional nature of their generosity, the way their giving always comes with invisible strings attached, the manner in which their apparent selflessness actually serves the deeply selfish goal of maintaining control over others' responses to them. Yet the most tragic aspect of the puppet master's art lies in its ultimate futility. No amount of control over others can provide what the narcissist actually seeks, the internal experience of feeling lovable, worthy, safe, and whole. These internal states cannot be manufactured through external manipulation, cannot be guaranteed through controlling others' behavior, cannot be achieved through even the most sophisticated psychological puppetry. The very act of trying to control love proves that one doesn't understand love's essential nature as a freely given gift that loses all meaning when coerced. The puppet theater becomes a closed system where the same drama plays out endlessly with different actors. The narcissist creates situations that confirm their belief that love must be earned through performance, that acceptance requires constant vigilance, that safety demands perpetual control. They direct others to play roles that validate their worldview, never recognizing that they're directing the very responses they point to as evidence of human nature's unreliability. In the depths of this control complex lies a profound spiritual crisis. The narcissist has lost faith in the essential goodness of human nature, in the possibility of unconditional love, in the trustworthiness of authentic connection. Their manipulation represents not evil but despair, not malice, but a profound loss of hope that genuine relationship is possible. They control others because they have given up on the possibility of being chosen freely, manipulate because they cannot imagine being valued for their authentic self. Yet, even within this elaborate system of control, the seeds of liberation exist. The very exhaustion that comes from constantly pulling strings may eventually point toward the desirability of letting go. The hollow victory of successful manipulation may begin to feel less satisfying than the risk of authentic connection. The puppet master may grow weary of their lonely throne, and begin to wonder what it might feel like to step down from their position of control and simply be present with another human being. The transformation begins when the narcissist develops what Jung called the courage to be disliked, the willingness to risk authentic self-expression, even if it doesn't generate the desired response, the strength to be present without agenda, even if it means losing control of the outcome, the faith to trust that genuine connection is possible, even without the safety net of manipulation. As the strings of control are gradually released, something miraculous begins to occur. Others, no longer feeling the pressure of invisible manipulation, begin to respond with greater authenticity. Relationships that were once elaborate puppet shows transform into genuine encounters between human beings. The narcissist discovers that what they could never achieve through control, authentic love, genuine respect, real connection, begins to emerge naturally when they stop trying to orchestrate it. The sacred ritual of control gives way to the sacred practice of presence. The puppet theater transforms into authentic relationship. In the grand theater of grandiosity, where every performance has been met with thunderous applause, where every scene has been directed to showcase magnificence, where every act has been crafted to confirm superiority. It begins with a simple sentence, spoken perhaps by a friend who has grown weary of the endless performance, or a therapist who has finally gathered the courage to speak truth to grandiosity, or even a stranger whose words carry the weight of absolute recognition. Your need to control others reveals how little control you have over yourself. These 17 words land in the consciousness like a meteor striking the earth, creating a crater so deep and wide that the entire landscape of self-perception is forever altered. Jung understood that such moments of recognition represent what he called the confrontation with the self, those rare instances when the ego's elaborate defenses suddenly become transparent, when the carefully maintained illusions dissolve like morning mist, when the gap between who we pretend to be and who we actually are becomes so obvious that denial is no longer possible. This is not insight gained through gradual learning, but revelation delivered like lightning, illuminating in one terrible liberating flash the entire architecture of self-deception. The words reverberate through the halls of consciousness with the persistence of a bell that cannot be unrung. Your need to control others. The first part of the sentence exposes what the narcissist has spent their entire lifetime trying to disguise, that their apparent strength is actually desperate need, that their seeming independence is actually profound dependency, that their displays of power are actually confessions of powerlessness. The very thing they have worked so hard to hide, their need is revealed as the driving force behind all their elaborate performances. Reveals how little control you have over yourself. The second part of the sentence delivers the fatal blow to the entire edifice of grandiose self-perception. The one who has presented themselves as the master of their domain, the director of their own magnificent drama, the sovereign ruler of their carefully constructed kingdom, is suddenly revealed as subject to forces they can neither understand nor direct. The puppet master is exposed as the puppet, the director as the one being directed by unconscious impulses they cannot acknowledge, let alone master. This recognition creates what Jung called a collision of opposites, the moment when the conscious persona and the unconscious shadow meet in direct confrontation, when the idealized self-image crashes into the reality of actual experience with such force that something entirely new must emerge from the wreckage. The narcissist experiences this collision, not as learning but as a form of psychological death, the dissolution of everything they have believed themselves to be. The fatal recognition penetrates layer after layer of carefully constructed defense, each level of protection proving as ineffective as tissue paper against the burning clarity of this truth. The golden mask cracks, the compensatory crown tumbles, the palace built on quicksand begins to sway, the puppet strings tangle and break, all in the space between the speaking and the hearing of these simple words. The narcissist stands suddenly naked in the ruins of their elaborate psychological architecture, exposed not as the monster they feared they were, but as the human being they never learned they were allowed to be. In this moment of devastating clarity, the entire mythology of the grandiose self is revealed as what it always was, a heroic but ultimately futile attempt to achieve the impossible through the unnecessary. The narcissist has been trying to control their internal experience through external manipulation, to achieve inner peace through outer dominance, to find authentic self-worth through manufactured superiority. The recognition shows not just that this strategy has failed, but that it was always designed to fail, that it was addressing the wrong problem with the wrong solution. The words continue their work of demolition, reaching depths of awareness that have been sealed off for decades. The narcissist begins to see their entire history through this new lens of recognition. Every moment of manipulation revealed as a confession of helplessness, every display of superiority exposed as evidence of inferiority, every performance of control shown to be proof of complete lack of self-mastery. The past rearranges itself like pieces of a puzzle, suddenly falling into a new pattern, creating a picture so different from the one they have been seeing that it requires a complete reorientation of identity. Jung observed that such moments of recognition often feel like psychic death, because in a very real sense, they are the persona that has been carefully constructed over decades, dies in the face of undeniable truth. The false self that has been nurtured and protected dissolves like salt in water. The grandiose identity that has been the central organizing principle of existence simply ceases to be viable. What the narcissist experiences as annihilation is actually liberation, but the death must be fully experienced before the rebirth can begin. The fatal recognition creates a profound reversal of perspective, what Jung called enantiodromia, the turning of something into its opposite. The narcissist's greatest source of pride, their ability to control others, is revealed as their greatest source of shame. Their most impressive skill, manipulation, is exposed as their most profound disability. Their apparent strength, independence, is shown to be their deepest weakness. Everything they thought they knew about themselves inverts like a photographic negative, suddenly exposed to light. In the aftermath of this recognition, the narcissist enters what mystics have called the dark night of the soul, a period of profound disorientation, where all familiar landmarks of identity have disappeared, where the old ways of being no longer work but new ways have not yet emerged. This is terrifying territory for someone whose entire existence has been organized around the maintenance of control and the preservation of a superior image. They find themselves in the wilderness of authentic being without map or compass, with only the rubble of their former certainties for company. Yet within this apparent destruction lies the seed of genuine reconstruction. The fatal recognition that destroys the false self creates space for the authentic self to finally breathe, to stretch, to begin the long journey toward wholeness. The narcissist begins to understand that what they thought was their greatest fear, being ordinary, being human, being vulnerable, is actually their greatest gift waiting to be unwrapped. In this new landscape of awareness, the narcissist encounters what Jung called the transcendent function, the psychological capacity to hold paradox without resolution, to experience contradiction without collapse, to be simultaneously shattered and whole, destroyed and reborn, nothing and everything. This is the beginning of what Jung termed individuation, the process by which the ego learns to serve the self rather than demanding that the self serve the ego. The fatal recognition becomes the foundation of authentic humility, not the false humility that is simply inverted grandiosity, but the genuine humility that comes from recognizing one's actual place in the larger web of existence. The narcissist discovers that they are neither the god they pretended to be, nor the worthless creature they feared they were, but something far more precious and rare, a human being capable of growth, of love, of authentic connection, of genuine contribution to the world. As the dust settles from the collapse of grandiosity, what emerges is not the emptiness, the narcissist always feared would be revealed, but a solid core of authentic being that was always present, waiting patiently beneath the elaborate performances for the moment when it would finally be allowed to exist without apology, without enhancement, without the burden of being more than human. The fatal recognition proves to be not fatal at all, but birth-giving. The death it brings is the death of illusion, making space for the life of reality. The destruction it causes is the destruction of prison walls, creating freedom for the authentic self to finally emerge. The devastation it wreaks is the devastation of lies, clearing ground for the truth that has always been waiting to take root and grow. The words that seem to destroy everything actually create everything, not the magnificent fiction of grandiose specialness, but the quiet miracle of ordinary authenticity, not the hollow victory of superiority, but the solid satisfaction of genuine self-acceptance, not the exhausting performance of control, but the restful practice of presence, not the lonely throne of the false self, but the warm embrace of the human family, where the narcissist finally discovers they have always belonged. There comes a moment in every constructed life when the architecture of illusion can no longer bear its own weight. The moment arrives not as a gentle awakening, but as a catastrophic recognition, a sudden terrible clarity that pierces through the elaborate tapestry of self-deception like lightning through darkness. For the one who has lived within the golden palace of their own grandiosity, this moment is nothing less than the apocalypse of the known self. The empire of ego, built stone by stone through years of careful positioning, strategic relationships, and meticulously crafted presentations, begins to tremble. This is the moment when the narcissist first glimpses their own profound powerlessness, not the temporary setbacks that can be rationalized, not the minor defeats that can be reframed as strategic retreats, but the fundamental, inescapable truth of human limitation. The recognition arrives like a cold wind through an open door, bringing with it the scent of mortality, vulnerability, and ordinary humanness. The carefully constructed identity, that magnificent edifice of superiority, specialness, and control, reveals itself to be built not on bedrock, but on sand. Every achievement that once felt like proof of inherent greatness now appears fragile and contingent. Every relationship that seemed to confirm their elevated status now shows its conditional nature. Every moment of triumph that once fed the grandiose narrative now crumbles into the dust of temporal insignificance. In this moment of recognition, the ego experiences what Jung understood as the first phase of the individuation process, the dissolution of the persona, the death of the false self that has masqueraded as the true one. But for the narcissist, this dissolution is particularly catastrophic because the persona has not merely been a social mask, it has been the totality of their experienced identity. The collapse begins in the realm of external validation. The mirrors that once reflected back the image of greatness begin to show a different face, tired, aging, ordinary, human. The audience that once applauded now seems distracted, unimpressed, or worse, pitying. The stage upon which the grand performance has been enacted suddenly appears small, shabby, irrelevant. The applause that once filled the inner emptiness with temporary meaning fades into the silence of indifference. Like ancient walls, weathered by centuries of wind and rain, the defenses that have protected the grandiose self from the harsh reality of ordinariness begin to crumble. Each crack reveals another layer of self-deception, another foundation built on the shifting sands of external approval. The recognition of powerlessness spreads like water through limestone, seeping into every carefully constructed narrative, every meticulously maintained illusion. The narcissist discovers that their power over others was always an illusion, a magic trick performed with smoke and mirrors, sustained only as long as the audience chose to believe. The control they exercised was revealed to be manipulation, and manipulation works only until it is recognized for what it is. The fear they inspired was shown to be temporary. dissolving the moment people found the courage to see behind the curtain of intimidation. More devastating still is the recognition that their power over themselves was equally illusory. The iron will that seemed to bend reality to their desires now appears as brittle as old parchment. The invincibility that felt so real crumbles at the touch of genuine challenge. The immunity to ordinary human suffering proves to be nothing more than an elaborate form of dissociation, a psychological sleight of hand that worked only until the pain became too great to ignore. The unraveling accelerates with each passing day. Relationships built on the foundation of inequality begin to shift and crack. People who once seemed content to play supporting roles in the narcissist's grand drama suddenly demand their own agency, their own dignity, their own right to be seen and heard. The script that once felt so natural, where others existed primarily to reflect and validate the narcissist's specialness, no longer works. The other actors have gone off script, insisting on their own humanity, their own complexity, their own inherent worth. Professional achievements that once felt like confirmation of inherent superiority now appear in their proper context as the result of circumstances, opportunities, and yes, some degree of effort and talent, but nothing that elevates the achiever above the common lot of humanity. The pedestal upon which the ego had placed itself reveals its constructed nature, built not from the stone of genuine accomplishment, but from the scaffolding of comparison, competition, and the diminishment of others. The body, too, participates in this great collapse. The vessel that was once seen as superior, more attractive, more powerful, more commanding, begins to show its mortality with merciless clarity. Age, fatigue, illness, the simple wear and tear of existing in physical form all conspire to demolish the illusion of transcendence. The narcissist discovers that they are not, after all, exempt from the universal human experience of embodied limitation. In the midst of this collapse, panic sets in. The ego, faced with its imminent dissolution, fights back with desperate fury. It tries to shore up the crumbling defenses, to find new sources of validation, to rebuild the familiar structures of superiority and control. But these efforts feel increasingly hollow, like trying to catch smoke with bare hands. The more frantically the ego grasps for its former glory, the more completely that glory slips away. This is the phase Jung understood as enantiodromia, the running contrary, the moment when any psychological attitude carried to its extreme flips into its opposite. The supreme confidence becomes crushing self-doubt. The sense of being above human limitation transforms into feeling utterly crushed by ordinary human constraints. The belief in one's own exceptional nature gives way to a devastating recognition of one's profound ordinariness. The social world, which once seemed to revolve around the narcissist's magnetic presence, continues to turn without them. Projects move forward without their input. Conversations happen without their participation. Decisions are made without their approval. The world reveals its shocking capacity to exist independently of their will, their vision, their control. They discover that they are not, as they had believed, the protagonist of the universal story, but merely one character among billions, no more essential to the plot than any other. This recognition of dispensability cuts to the very core of the grandiose identity. The narcissist realizes that their absence would not create a vacuum in the universe, would not bring the world to a grinding halt, would not even be particularly noticed by most people. They are forced to confront the truth that their significance exists primarily in their own mind, sustained by elaborate mental gymnastics and the carefully managed perceptions of others. The collapse extends into the realm of meaning itself, the grand narrative that once gave shape and purpose to existence, the story of their own exceptional journey, their destined greatness, their important mission in the world, crumbles like a house of cards in a hurricane. Without this organizing principle, life itself seems to lose its coherence, its direction, its very reason for being. Yet in this moment of absolute devastation, something profound begins to stir. Beneath the rubble of the collapsed ego structure, something authentic starts to breathe. The recognition of powerlessness, devastating as it is, creates space for something new to be born. In acknowledging their fundamental limitations, their essential humanity, their complete ordinariness, the narcissist takes the first step toward genuine authenticity. The death of the false self, catastrophic though it feels, is actually the precondition for the birth of the true self. This is the sacred paradox of psychological transformation. Only by fully accepting our powerlessness do we discover our true power. Only by embracing our ordinariness do we find our authentic specialness. Only by allowing the grandiose identity to die completely do we create the space for genuine selfhood to emerge. The collapse is not the end of the story. It is the necessary prelude to rebirth. The ancient walls that once seemed to provide protection now reveal themselves to have been a prison. Their collapse, terrifying though it may be, is actually the first taste of freedom. Freedom from the exhausting effort of maintaining an illusion. Freedom from the constant need for external validation. Freedom from the burden of having to be more than human. In the ruins of the ego's empire, the seeds of authentic selfhood begin to sprout, ready to grow into something genuinely beautiful, genuinely valuable, genuinely connected to the larger wholeness of existence. The great collapse is complete. The empire has fallen, but from its ashes, something infinitely more precious than grandiosity prepares to emerge. The simple, profound, revolutionary truth of being authentically, courageously, vulnerably human. In the aftermath of the great collapse, a terrible silence descends, not the comfortable silence of meditation or the peaceful quiet of contentment, but the hollow silence of a world stripped of its familiar sounds, the silence that follows the end of everything known. This is the grado, the blackening phase of the alchemical transformation, where the prima materia of the soul lies dissolved in its own darkness, waiting for something new to crystallize from the dissolution. The narcissist finds themselves in a landscape as barren as the surface of the moon, where once there was the bustling metropolis of grandiose identity, with its monuments to self-importance, its theaters of performance, its temples of validation. Now there is only emptiness. The ego, that great architect of illusion, lies in ruins, and with it has crumbled every familiar landmark by which the self once navigated existence. In this wilderness, the most basic questions become unanswerable torments. Who am I, if not the magnificent being I believed myself to be? What is my purpose, if not the grand mission I thought I was destined to fulfill? Why do I exist, if not to shine brighter than others, to stand above the common crowd, to be special in ways that matter to the world? These questions echo in the emptiness, like voices calling across a vast canyon, returning only as hollow reverberations that mock the very act of asking. The rawness of this phase is almost unbearable. Without the protective armor of grandiosity, every slight feels like a mortal wound. Without the cushioning effect of superiority, every failure cuts to the bone. Without the numbing drug of being special, ordinary human pain becomes excruciating in its naked intensity. The narcissist discovers what it means to be vulnerable in a way they have spent their entire life avoiding, completely, helplessly, inescapably human. Sleep becomes elusive, haunted by dreams of former glory that dissolve upon waking into the harsh light of present reality. Waking hours stretch endlessly, filled with a peculiar kind of suffering that seems to have no beginning and no end, no clear cause and no obvious remedy. This is not the clean pain of a broken bone or the focused grief of a clear loss, but the diffuse agony of existential displacement, the pain of being nowhere, of being no one, of mattering to no one, including oneself. The body rebels against this psychic dissolution. Appetite disappears or becomes ravenous and indiscriminate. Energy drains away like water through a broken vessel, leaving behind a fatigue that sleep cannot cure. The very cells seem to participate in the general malaise, as if the collapse of psychological structure has somehow communicated itself to the biological level, creating a symphony of dysfunction that mirrors the chaos within. In this phase, the former narcissist begins to understand what they had unconsciously known all along but had fought desperately to avoid. They are not special. They are not chosen. They are not destined for greatness. They are not exempt from the universal human experience of limitation, disappointment, aging, failure, and eventual death. This recognition, which would be merely sobering for someone with a healthy ego structure, feels like a death sentence for someone whose entire identity was built on the opposite premise. Yet it is in this invisibility that the first glimmers of truth begin to appear, stripped of the need to perform, to impress, to maintain the exhausting theater of grandiosity. The narcissist begins to see the world as it actually is, rather than as a stage for their own drama. This revelation is simultaneously devastating and liberating. Devastating, because it confirms the complete collapse of the grandiose worldview. Liberating, because it offers the first taste of what genuine relationship might feel like. Connection based not on what others can provide for the ego, but on simple recognition of shared humanity. In the wilderness of lost identity, the narcissist begins to glimpse what they have been missing all along, the profound relief of not having to be more than human. The paradox of this phase becomes apparent in losing everything they thought they were. They begin to discover who they actually are. Beneath the rubble of collapsed grandiosity, something authentic starts to stir, not the false self that demanded constant validation, but a quieter, more resilient core that has somehow survived the devastation. This is not the triumphant emergence of a new identity, but rather the tentative recognition that there is something there, something real, something that exists independently of external confirmation. The wilderness teaches its own curriculum. In the absence of the familiar sources of meaning and purpose, the narcissist is forced to find sustenance in smaller, simpler truths. A moment of genuine connection with another person. The satisfaction of completing a task well, even if no one notices. The quiet pleasure of understanding something new about themselves or the world. These experiences, which would have seemed trivial in the days of grandiose ambition, now carry the weight of revelation. Time moves differently in this phase. Minutes can feel like hours when filled with the intense discomfort of facing reality without filters. Days blur together in a haze of readjustment and mourning. Yet occasionally there are moments of unexpected clarity, brief respites from the storm where the rawness gives way to something approaching peace. Not the peace of resolution, but the peace of exhaustion, of finally stopping the struggle to be something other than what one is. The dark night serves its ancient purpose to strip away everything that is not essential, everything that is constructed rather than authentic, everything that separates the individual from the ground of their true being. For the narcissist, this stripping away is particularly thorough because so much of their identity was artificial to begin with. But this thoroughness, painful as it is, creates the possibility for a more complete transformation than might otherwise be possible. In the deepest part of this darkness, when all hope seems lost and the way forward appears completely obscured, something remarkable begins to happen. The narcissist starts to develop a different relationship with their own vulnerability. Instead of seeing it as evidence of failure or weakness, they begin to recognize it as the gateway to genuine humanness. The raw openness that felt so terrifying starts to reveal itself as the prerequisite for authentic connection, both with others and with the deeper layers of their own being. This is the negredo in its fullest expression, the necessary dissolution that precedes any real transformation. The narcissist wanders in this wilderness not as punishment, but as preparation. Every comfortable illusion must be stripped away. Every false support must be removed. Every artificial prop must be eliminated before the authentic self can emerge from beneath the debris of the constructed personality. The wilderness is vast, and the wandering seems endless, but it is not purposeless. Each step deeper into this trackless landscape is also a step closer to the truth that waits at the center of the labyrinth. The recognition that being human, simply and completely human, is enough. More than enough. It is everything. In the deepest caverns of the wilderness, where the darkness has grown so complete that even the memory of light seems like a childhood fairy tale, something extraordinary begins to happen. This is the great paradox that the ancient healers understood. The physician who has never been ill cannot truly heal illness, and the guide who has never been lost cannot lead others out of the labyrinth. The narcissist, having descended into the deepest chambers of their own brokenness, discovers that their shattered state is not the end of their story, but the beginning of their true qualification to be of service in the world. The recognition dawns slowly, like sunrise over a landscape that has known only night. Each acknowledged wound becomes a doorway to deeper understanding. The shame that once felt like proof of worthlessness transforms into compassion for others who carry similar burdens. The humiliation that seemed like ultimate defeat reveals itself as the demolition of false pride that was blocking access to genuine humility. The powerlessness that felt like spiritual death becomes the foundation for a different kind of power, not power over others, but power with others, power that emerges from shared vulnerability, rather than manufactured superiority. This transformation does not happen through denial of the wounds or premature forgiveness of the self. It happens through what Jung understood as the integration of the shadow, the full acceptance of one's damaged, flawed, thoroughly human nature. The narcissist learns to sit with their brokenness without trying to fix it, explain it away, or transform it into another form of specialness. In this sitting, this bearing witness to their own wounded condition, they discover that vulnerability is not the opposite of strength, but its deepest source. The body teaches this lesson first. After months or years of carrying the tension of grandiose performance, the muscles learn to soften. The jaw unclenches from its perpetual readiness to defend or attack. The shoulders release their protective hunch. The breathing deepens, no longer constrained by the armor of false invincibility. In this physical surrender, the narcissist experiences their first taste of what it means to inhabit their human form without apology, without the exhausting effort to transcend its limitations. This embodied vulnerability creates space for authentic emotion to flow. Tears that have been held back for decades by the dam of prideful control finally break through. Not the manipulative tears designed to elicit sympathy or attention, but the cleansing tears of genuine grief. Grief for the years lost to illusion. Grief for the relationships damaged by grandiose manipulation. Grief for the simple human experiences that were sacrificed on the altar of being special. The wounded healer emerges not through any process of self-improvement or spiritual achievement, but through the simple act of accepting their woundedness as a gift rather than a curse. They begin to understand that their capacity to help others heal is directly proportional to their willingness to remain in conscious contact with their own brokenness. This is not the false humility that secretly hopes for praise, but the genuine humility that recognizes brokenness as the universal human condition. In conversations with others, something remarkable begins to happen. Where once the narcissist would have listened only for opportunities to insert their own superior insights or experiences, they now find themselves naturally attuning to the pain behind the words. Their own experience of devastation has created an internal resonance chamber that can detect and respond to the suffering of others with unprecedented accuracy and compassion. The transformation is evident in the quality of their listening. Where once their attention was constantly divided between what others were saying and how they might respond in ways that would enhance their own image, they now find themselves capable of full presence. The narcissistic need to be the most interesting person in the room has been replaced by genuine curiosity about the inner worlds of others. They discover that every person carries stories of profound depth and complexity, stories that were invisible to them when they were preoccupied with maintaining their own superior position. The wounded healer learns to speak from their scars rather than their achievements. When someone shares a struggle with addiction, they can respond not with superior advice, but with the hard-earned wisdom of someone who has faced their own compulsions. When someone describes the pain of failed relationships, they can offer not judgment, but understanding born from their own experience of how grandiose self-absorption destroys the possibility of genuine intimacy. This authenticity carries a power that their former grandiose presentations never possessed. People sense immediately when they are in the presence of someone who has been broken and rebuilt, someone who speaks from lived experience rather than theoretical knowledge or borrowed wisdom. The wounded healer's words carry the weight of truth because they have been forged in the fire of genuine transformation. Yet the paradox deepens the more fully they embrace their woundedness, the more whole they become. Not the artificial wholeness of grandiose inflation, but the genuine wholeness that includes and integrates all aspects of human experience, light and shadow, strength and weakness, triumph and failure. They discover that wholeness is not the absence of brokenness, but the capacity to hold brokenness with love. This integration of opposites, Jung's concept of the transcendent function, begins to operate spontaneously. The former narcissist no longer needs to choose between being strong or weak, special or ordinary, wounded or healed. They can be all of these things simultaneously, holding the tension of paradox without needing to resolve it into a simpler, more manageable truth. In this new role, the former narcissist discovers a different kind of specialness, not the specialness that separates and elevates, but the specialness that connects and serves. They are special in the way that every person who has descended into their own depths and returned with wisdom is special. It is a specialness earned through suffering, tempered by humility, and dedicated to the healing of others who walk the same difficult path. The wounded healer has found their true vocation, to stand at the threshold between illness and health, between despair and hope, between the false self and the authentic self, offering to others what they themselves received in their darkest hour, the presence of someone who understands, who has been there, who knows the way because they have walked it themselves. From the ashes of false grandiosity, a different kind of leadership begins to emerge, not the brittle authority that demands obedience through fear or manipulation, but the quiet sovereignty that invites others into their own power. This is the humble crown, worn not by one who stands above others, but by one who has learned to stand among them, leading not through domination, but through the magnetic pull of authentic being. The transformation is as subtle as it is profound. Where once the narcissist commanded attention through force of personality, dramatic gestures, and carefully orchestrated displays of superiority, they now draw others through something far more powerful, the gravitational field of genuine presence. Having descended into their own depths and integrated their shadow, they carry within themselves a quality of centeredness that others can sense immediately, like the still point around which all movement naturally organizes itself. This new authority bears no resemblance to the authority they once wielded. The old authority was built on separation, the distance between the superior leader and the inferior followers, maintained through mystery, intimidation, and the careful cultivation of dependency. The new authority is built on connection, the recognition that true leadership serves not to elevate the leader, but to awaken the leadership potential in everyone they encounter. The humble crown is invisible to those who seek the glittering diadems of worldly power, but unmistakable to those who have learned to recognize authentic sovereignty. It is worn by the teacher who creates space for students to discover their own wisdom rather than dispensing knowledge from on high. It adorns the parent who guides through example rather than control, showing children how to think rather than what to think. It rests upon the head of the healer, who empowers others to heal themselves rather than creating dependence on the healer's intervention. The quality of their presence speaks louder than any words they might utter. In meetings, people find themselves naturally turning toward them, not because they demand attention, but because they embody a quality of listening so complete, so present, so free from agenda that others feel truly heard, perhaps for the first time in their lives. Their questions arise not from a need to demonstrate their superior insight, but from genuine curiosity about the perspectives and experiences of others. This leader leads primarily through the art of creating space for others to speak their truth, space for creative solutions to emerge organically, space for the collective wisdom of the group to manifest. They have learned that the most profound leadership often involves knowing when not to lead, when to step back and allow others to step forward into their own authority. The humble crown transforms the very nature of decision-making, where the grandiose leader made decisions from a position of assumed superiority, gathering information primarily to confirm their predetermined conclusions. The humble leader approaches decisions with what Zen masters call don't know mind, a quality of openness that allows the best solution to emerge from the interaction of multiple perspectives, rather than the dominance of a single viewpoint. Their authority is grounded not in what they know, but in their willingness to acknowledge what they don't know. This intellectual humility, far from weakening their leadership, strengthens it immeasurably. People trust leaders who can admit uncertainty, who can say, "I don't know, let's figure this out together," who can change course when presented with new information without losing face or credibility. The former narcissist discovers that true leadership is less about having all the answers and more about asking the right questions. They learn to inquire rather than proclaim, to explore rather than dictate, to wonder rather than pronounce. Their questions create openings for innovation, for collaboration, for the kind of collective intelligence that emerges when people feel safe to contribute their authentic perspectives without fear of judgment or dismissal. This shift from knowing to wondering transforms every interaction. In conversations, they become more interested in understanding others than in being understood themselves. In conflicts, they seek first to comprehend all perspectives before advocating for any particular solution. In planning sessions, they create conditions where the best ideas can emerge from anywhere in the group, rather than flowing downward from the top of the hierarchy. The humble crown also transforms the leader's relationship with power itself. They begin to understand power not as something to be hoarded and wielded over others, but as something to be shared and multiplied through others. They discover that the more power they give away, the more powerful they become, not in the dominating sense, but in the sense of being able to effect positive change in the world through the empowerment of others. This paradox of power reveals itself in countless small moments. The manager who credits their team's success to the team members rather than claiming it for themselves finds that their team becomes more motivated, more creative, more willing to take risks and innovate. The parent who acknowledges their mistakes and apologizes when appropriate discovers that their children respect them more, not less, for their honesty and humility. The humble crown confers a different kind of charisma, not the flashy magnetism of the grandiose performer, but the quiet magnetism of someone who has found peace with themselves and therefore creates peace around themselves. People are drawn to this quality of inner stillness, this freedom from the desperate need to prove or impress or dominate. In the presence of such a leader, others feel permission to relax their own defensive postures, to show up more authentically, to risk being vulnerable and creative. This leader's influence spreads not through force or manipulation, but through modeling. They demonstrate through their own behavior what it looks like to lead from love rather than fear, from service rather than self-aggrandizement, from humility rather than hubris. Others absorb these lessons not through being told what to do, but through witnessing a different way of being in the world. The humble crown transforms even the experience of failure, where the grandiose leader feared failure as a threat to their carefully constructed image of invincibility. The humble leader embraces failure as information, as teacher, as opportunity for growth and course correction. They create cultures where failure is not punished but examined, where mistakes are not hidden but shared as learning opportunities for the entire group. This new relationship with failure liberates not only the leader but everyone around them. When people know they won't be punished for honest mistakes, They become more willing to take creative risks, to propose innovative solutions, to stretch beyond their comfort zones in service of the collective mission. The organization or family or community becomes a learning system rather than a performance arena. The authority of the humble crown is ultimately authority in service of love, not the sentimental love that avoids difficult conversations or necessary decisions, but the fierce love that will do whatever serves the highest good of all concerned, even when that requires saying hard truths or making unpopular choices. This leader has learned to distinguish between what people want and what they need, between what feels good in the moment and what serves long-term flourishing. The humble crown is earned through the courage of self-examination, worn with the grace of self-acceptance, and exercised with the wisdom of someone who has learned that true authority comes not from standing above others, but from helping others rise to their own full stature. It is leadership as midwifery, helping birth the highest potential in every person and situation they encounter. In wearing this invisible crown, the former narcissist discovers the leadership they were always meant to embody, not the leadership of ego and domination, but the leadership of soul and service, the kind of authority that heals rather than wounds, that unites rather than divides, that elevates everyone it touches toward their own authentic sovereignty. In the quiet revolution of the transformed heart, the most profound discovery awaits. Divinity does not reside in the perfection that transcends human limitation, but in the sacred ordinariness of embracing those limitations with grace. The former narcissist, having scaled the heights of grandiose fantasy, only to find them barren and cold, now discovers that the holy ground they sought in the stratosphere of specialness has been beneath their feet all along, waiting in the humble earth of everyday human experience. This recognition comes not as a thunderbolt of revelation, but as a gentle dawning, like morning light gradually illuminating a landscape that had been there all along but invisible in the darkness of ego inflation. The sacred reveals itself to be hidden not in the extraordinary achievements that set one apart from others, but in the ordinary experiences that connect one to the universal human condition, the shared struggles, the common joys. The transformation begins with the revolutionary act of accepting imperfection as perfect, where once every flaw felt like evidence of unworthiness, every mistake like proof of fundamental inadequacy. The awakening consciousness learns to see these very limitations as doorways into deeper truth. The crack in the facade becomes not something to be concealed, but something to be honored, for it is through our cracks that the light gets in, that connection becomes possible, that genuine intimacy can flourish. This is perhaps the most difficult teaching for the former narcissist to embrace, that their humanity is not something to be transcended, but something to be celebrated. The body that ages and tires, the mind that forgets and confuses, the heart that breaks and heals, these are not obstacles to spiritual realization, but its very medium. God, the divine, the sacred dimension of existence does not exist in some realm beyond human experience, but is woven into the very fabric of that experience, waiting to be recognized in each moment of authentic presence. The sacred ordinary reveals itself first in the body's honest responses. The fatigue that was once denied as weakness becomes a teacher of rest, showing the wisdom of natural cycles, the necessity of restoration, the beauty of surrendering to the rhythms that govern all living things. The hunger that was once either ignored in service of perfectionistic control or indulged in grandiose excess becomes a simple, honest request for nourishment, a reminder of the body's fundamental needs and the pleasure that comes from meeting them with mindful attention. Pain, too, transforms in this new awareness. The physical discomfort that was once experienced as an enemy to be defeated or a failure to be hidden becomes a messenger carrying important information about boundaries, about limits, about the need for care and attention. The emotional pain that was once numbed through grandiose fantasy or projected onto others becomes a teacher of compassion, showing the universality of suffering and the healing that comes from acknowledging rather than avoiding difficult feelings. In relationships, the sacred ordinary manifests as the courage to be imperfect in the presence of others. The former narcissist learns the profound intimacy that comes from allowing others to see them, not as they wish to be seen, brilliant, powerful, flawless, but as they actually are, struggling, learning, growing, failing, trying again. This vulnerability, which once felt like spiritual death, reveals itself to be the foundation of all authentic connection. The conversations transform, where once every interaction was an opportunity to demonstrate superiority or gather validation, exchanges become opportunities for genuine meeting. The simple act of asking, "How are you?" and actually waiting to hear the answer becomes a sacred practice. Listening without preparing to respond, receiving another's experience without immediately relating it to one's own, offering presence without trying to fix or change. These ordinary acts of human decency reveal themselves to be profound spiritual practices. The sacred ordinary appears in the mundane tasks that make up daily life. Washing dishes becomes an opportunity for mindful presence, feeling the warm water, the texture of soap, the satisfaction of transforming dirty into clean. Work, too, is transformed by this new vision. Whatever the former narcissist does for a living, whether it involves leading others, creating something beautiful, providing a service, or simply showing up with presence and competence, becomes an opportunity to contribute to the greater whole. The work itself need not be extraordinary or world-changing to be sacred. It need only be done with attention, with care, with the understanding that every honest effort contributes to the web of interdependence that sustains human life. The former narcissist discovers that failure, too, has its sacred dimension. Each mistake becomes not evidence of inadequacy, but proof of courage, the courage to risk, to try, to remain engaged with life despite the inevitable setbacks and disappointments. Failure reveals itself as the price of participation, the tuition for the school of experience, the credential that qualifies one to offer compassion to others who struggle. In this new understanding, limitation itself becomes a doorway to the divine. The very constraints that the grandiose ego experienced as prison walls, the need for sleep, for food, for shelter, for connection with others, reveal themselves as the boundaries that give shape to existence, the structure within which the dance of life can unfold, like the banks of a river that allow water to flow with purpose and direction. Human limitations create the form within which consciousness can express itself in time and space. The sacred ordinary teaches that holiness is not achieved through rising above the human condition, but through diving deeply into it with complete acceptance and presence. The mystics throughout history have discovered this same truth, that enlightenment is not escape from the world, but complete engagement with it, not transcendence of humanity, but full embodiment of it, not perfection, but the perfect acceptance of imperfection. This acceptance brings with it a profound peace, not the brittle calm of spiritual bypassing that denies difficult experiences, but the deep peace that comes from no longer fighting reality. The former narcissist learns to say yes to what is, to find God not in what should be or could be or might be, but in what actually is, right here, right now, exactly as it presents itself. The sacred ordinary transforms even solitude, where once being alone was either an opportunity for grandiose fantasy or a torment of self-criticism. It becomes a chance for communion with the deeper dimensions of existence. In the silence of their own company, the former narcissist discovers they are never truly alone. They are always in relationship with the mystery that animates all existence, the consciousness that looks through their eyes, the love that beats their heart without their effort or control. This recognition extends to all of existence, the tree outside the window, the stranger on the street, the difficult colleague, the beloved friend. All are recognized as expressions of the same divine mystery that expresses itself through the former narcissist's own existence. The boundaries between self and other, sacred and mundane, special and ordinary, begin to dissolve not into grandiose inflation, but into humble recognition of the unity that underlies all apparent separation. The former narcissist learns to pray without words, to worship without ritual, to commune with the divine through the simple act of being fully present to whatever is happening in each moment. Walking becomes a pilgrimage, breathing becomes a prayer, eating becomes communion, sleeping becomes a daily practice of surrender to forces larger than the ego's control. The sacred ordinary becomes not just a philosophy but a lived reality, a moment-by-moment choice to find the divine in the mundane, the eternal in the temporal, the perfect in the imperfect. This is the deepest teaching of the transformed life, that we are already what we have been seeking. We are already where we have been trying to go. We are already perfect in our very imperfection, already sacred in our beautiful, broken, thoroughly ordinary humanity. The journey that began with the terrible recognition of powerlessness that descended through the dark night of ego death and wandered in the wilderness of dissolved identity now completes its ancient arc. The former narcissist stands now at the threshold between two worlds, the world of grandiose separation they have left behind and the world of humble connection they have discovered. But the return is not a simple restoration to a previous state. The consciousness that re-enters the world has been fundamentally altered by its journey through the underworld. The world they return to is the same world they left, yet everything appears different through the lens of transformed perception. The hierarchies that once seemed so important, who is above whom, who has more status, who deserves more recognition, reveal themselves to be largely arbitrary constructions that obscure the deeper truth of fundamental human equality. The competitions that once drove their ambition, for wealth, for fame, for power over others, appear as elaborate games that distract from the real work of becoming fully human. This shift in perception creates a profound reorientation of purpose, where once the narcissist's energy was directed toward elevating themselves above others, now it flows naturally toward lifting others up to their own full potential. The zero-sum game of grandiose competition gives way to the collaborative dance of mutual flourishing. They discover that serving others' highest good serves their own highest good, not because it brings them praise or recognition, but because it aligns them with the deeper currents of life that flow toward healing, growth, and connection. The service that emerges from this transformation is qualitatively different from the service the narcissist might have performed in their previous state. Then, acts of apparent generosity often carried hidden agendas, the need to be seen as good, the desire to create obligation in others, the hunger for recognition and praise. Now service flows from a different source, the simple recognition that individual well-being and collective well-being are ultimately inseparable, that healing the wounds in others helps heal the wounds in the larger web of existence, of which all are part. This service takes many forms, as varied as the individuals who undertake the journey of transformation. Some become healers in the literal sense, using their hard-won understanding of psychological and spiritual wounds to help others navigate their own dark nights of the soul. Some become teachers, sharing not abstract knowledge, but lived wisdom, offering guidance to those who are beginning their own descent into the underworld of self-examination. Others serve through their presence alone, becoming stable points of authentic being in a world often driven by performance and pretense. Their very existence becomes a form of teaching, demonstrating through their daily lives what it looks like to be human without apology, to be imperfect without shame, to be ordinary without feeling diminished. They become living examples of the truth that was so difficult for them to accept, that being human is enough, that ordinariness is sacred, that limitation is not failure but simply the condition within which love learns to express itself. The former narcissist discovers that their most powerful service often involves simply showing up authentically to whatever life presents. In family relationships, they offer presence without agenda, listening without the need to fix or change, support without the secret expectation of gratitude or recognition. In work environments, they contribute their skills and energy without the compulsive need to be the star, finding satisfaction in collective success rather than individual glory. Their relationship with leadership transforms completely. Where once they sought positions of authority to feed their grandiose self-image, now they accept leadership roles only when such acceptance serves the greater good. When they do lead, they lead from behind, creating conditions where others can discover their own capacity for wisdom and decision-making. They understand that the highest form of leadership is often making oneself unnecessary, empowering others to such a degree that the formal leader becomes obsolete. This transformation extends to their relationship with conflict and difficulty. Where once they either avoided challenging situations that might threaten their image or engaged with them in ways designed to demonstrate their superiority, they now approach difficulties as opportunities for deeper service. They bring to conflicts not the need to win, but the commitment to find solutions that honor everyone involved. They engage with problems not as platforms for displaying their brilliance, but as chances to contribute to collective understanding and resolution. The eternal return also transforms their relationship with recognition and praise. Having learned to find their worth in simply being who they are rather than in external validation, they become free to receive appreciation without being addicted to it, and to face criticism without being destroyed by it. This emotional equilibrium allows them to serve more effectively because their service is not contaminated by the need for particular responses from those they serve. The transformed consciousness also brings a different quality of patience to their service. Having experienced the long, slow process of their own transformation, the years of wandering in the wilderness, the gradual emergence from darkness, the patient integration of shadow and light, they understand that real change cannot be rushed. They become midwives to others' transformation, offering support and presence while respecting the natural timing of each person's journey toward authenticity. This patience extends to their view of societal change as well. Where once they might have been drawn to grandiose visions of single-handedly transforming the world, they now understand that lasting change happens through countless individual transformations, through the slow cultivation of wisdom and compassion in human hearts, through the patient work of creating conditions where others can discover their own authentic path. The eternal return reveals that the journey of transformation is not a linear progression from problem to solution, but a spiral dance where the same themes return again and again at deeper levels of understanding. The former narcissist discovers that they will continue to encounter their old patterns, the temptation toward grandiosity, the pull of ego inflation, the desire to be special, but now they meet these patterns as old friends rather than enemies, recognizing them as signals that it's time to return once again to the practices of humility, service, and authentic connection. They learn to hold their own transformation lightly, neither taking credit for their growth as if it were a personal achievement, nor becoming attached to their new identity as a transformed person. They understand that transformation is not a destination, but a way of traveling, not a state to be attained, but a quality of presence to be continuously cultivated. The eternal return is not an ending, but a beginning, the beginning of a life dedicated not to the aggrandizement of the separate self, but to the flourishing of the interconnected whole. In choosing to serve this greater wholeness, the former narcissist finds not the diminishment they once feared, but the expansion they always sought, not through rising above others, but through joining with them in the ancient, ongoing work of creating a world where all beings can discover and express their authentic nature. They have returned from the underworld carrying the gift that can only be earned through the courage of complete self-examination, the knowledge that we are all wounded healers, all broken vessels through which love learns to pour itself into the world, all ordinary humans called to the extraordinary task of serving something larger than our individual fears and desires. In accepting this calling, they complete the eternal return and begin the next spiral of the never-ending journey toward greater wholeness, greater service, greater love.